The continued spread of NATO and its encroachment into Russia's sphere of influence is repeatedly harped on by Vladimir Putin as a reason for his illegal invasion of Ukraine. Is this a legitimate concern for the Russian leader and his country? Tension between Russia and NATO can be traced back to before Putin took power. The Soviet Union, utilizing a centralized economy, was struggling to compete with capitalist Western countries who allied together under NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was created to pool resources of Western European democratic nations in order to fund a massive military alliance which could yield weapons and soldiers if conflict with the Soviets transpired. The Soviet style of communism, repressive and authoritarian in its nature, cultivated massive amounts of political unrest within Eastern Europe. Political uprisings, particularly in Poland and Hungary, had prompted citizens in East Germany living under intense Soviet surveillance to demand autonomy and freedom from government overreach. Eventually, the political pressure and Mikhail Gorbachev's reluctance to use force reached a breaking point, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989. This marked the potential reunification of Germany and the collapse of the physical and ideological barrier separating the capitalist West from the communist East. Important precedent extending all the way back to the 1990s can inform us of the embers that gave way to the eventual flame of war that has engulfed Ukraine today. Bringing order to chaos, Gorbachev immediately began negotiations with the de facto decision-maker of NATO, the United States Department of State, headed by the skilled United States Secretary of State, James Baker. Gorbachev, fearing the implications of a united German state ushered into the NATO alliance, acquiesced to Baker's claim that, given German reunification, NATO would not expand its jurisdiction. In fact, there are many instances of these quote-unquote assurances, which is what the United States has labeled them, seeking to delegitimize the claims or promises put forth by individuals including James Baker and others. The first of these assurances was professed in a 1990 speech detailing German unification by West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher. The United States Embassy, in response to the speech, cabled the American capital in order to inform them of its contents. The German foreign minister explicitly stated, quote, NATO should rule out an expansion of its territory towards the east, i.e. moving it closer to the Soviet borders, end quote. Essentially, in order for the Soviet premier to accept German reunification, guarantees against the eastward spread of NATO was required. James Baker, sufficiently persuaded by Genscher, adopted the same rationale when he met face-to-face with Gorbachev. Baker assured Gorbachev the executive branch believed that, quote, not only for the Soviet Union, but for other European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastward direction, end quote. Baker, briefing the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, reiterated his stance on NATO expansion. Quote, certainly any extension of the zone of NATO would be unacceptable. By implication, NATO in its current zone might be acceptable, end quote. Analysts will argue these conversations took place only within the context of German reunification and excluded Central and Eastern Europe. However, Genscher, upon meeting with British Foreign Minister Douglas Hurd, explained, quote, the Russians must have some assurance that if, for example, the Polish government left the Warsaw Pact one day, they would not join NATO the next, end quote. Why were these assurances required for the Soviet premier? The fundamental existence of NATO is characterized by an adversarial stance against the Russian state. Countries that were brought into the NATO alliance were expected to provide or harbor arms and soldiers that would be used in the event of conflict with Russia. Obviously, sovereign countries can make their own decisions on who to cooperate with. However, attempting to envelop countries in Russia's sphere of influence into an alliance that fundamentally views Russia as an enemy is an incredibly hard pill for the Russians to swallow. Many political commentators will declare that the fall of the Soviet Union renders these assurances moot. Although this is politically true, it is undeniable that the new Russian state, if given the choice, would receive these assurances with open arms. In addition, the arguments articulated by Baker and accepted by Gorbachev for providing these assurances remain valid even with the regime change in Russia. Relating this back to the current crisis, Putin, commentating on the fall of the Soviet regime in an interview with American journalist Tucker Carlson, said, quote, "Russia expected to be taken into the fraternal family of civilized peoples. Nothing like that happened. You deceived us," end quote. Putin reassures Carlson that he means the United States when he says you. Quote, "You promised that there would be no NATO expansion to the east, but this happened 5 times," end quote. It seems commonsensical to understand the Russians would not tolerate NATO encroachment onto their border, given NATO's fundamental goal. Instead of accepting that fact, the United States Department of State has chosen to ignore it and escalate tensions with the Russians, despite Russia's longing to cooperate with the West. If one is inclined to dismiss the United States Department of State's guarantee, quote, "NATO would not shift 1 inch eastward," end quote, as irrelevant, then they must confront Russia's wish to join NATO itself. According to the United States Office of the Historian, NATO exists, quote, "to provide collective security against the Soviet Union," end quote. We must apply the same logic political analysts use to deny the legitimacy of the assurances provided by the United States to the Soviet government, which is the collapse of the Soviet regime renders the assurances, quote, "NATO would not shift 1 inch eastward," end quote, inapplicable to NATO. Doing this, it is logical to conclude NATO, lacking its foundational enemy, the Soviet Union, no longer has a legitimate reason to exist. This is greatly exacerbated when the regime replacing the Soviet government wishes to join forces with the West and enter into the military alliance, in line with the sentiment expressed by Putin to Carlson. Putin, a murderous and conniving politician, informed Oliver Stone, an American film director, about a meeting with President Bill Clinton in 2000. Quote, "During the meeting, I said, let's consider an option that Russia might join NATO. Clinton said, why not? But the U.S. delegation got very nervous," end quote. In another interview in 2000 with Putin, headed by British journalist David Frost, Frost asked if it, quote, "is possible Russia could join NATO," end quote. Putin, who was serving as active president, responded, quote, "I do not see why not," end quote. The question must be asked, why was Russia, still a global superpower with a nuclear weapon arsenal rivaling that of the United States, not welcomed by NATO with open arms? Russia joining NATO would render the alliance aimless. What does this have to do with the current conflict in Ukraine? Putin has taken offense to NATO's encroachment on his border and has protested against NATO's willingness at a 2008 summit in Bucharest to welcome Ukraine and Georgia into the alliance, but not Russia itself. Despite these obvious and understandable grievances, the United States has steered NATO into an increasingly adversarial stance towards Russia. What benefit does America get from stationing NATO troops and weapons in countries like Ukraine and Georgia? How does installing NATO military bases in countries that border Russia constitute defensive measures? It seems as if the United States Department of State is testing the waters with Putin, possibly even backing him into a corner, observing what he will put up with and when he will respond forcefully rather than diplomatically. Putin, in conversation with Tucker Carlson, argues, quote, "We never agreed to NATO's expansion, and moreover, we never agreed that Ukraine would be in NATO. We did not agree to NATO bases there without any discussion with us," end quote. This appears to have been a major issue with the Russian president who, according to the Associated Press, quote, "said the military action was a forced measure that stemmed from rising security risks for Russia," end quote. Although this is an obvious falsehood, the West did not literally force Putin to invade Ukraine. It is beyond obvious that the NATO countries, predominantly the United States, could have easily prevented the invasion from occurring. An obvious preventative measure that was not taken by the United States was to guarantee Ukraine would not be received into the NATO alliance. 2014 marked the turning point of bringing the current Ukraine-Russia conflict into fruition. In February of 2014, social unrest resulting from a rejection to align economically with the West forced Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych to flee Russia for refuge. Responding promptly, the Ukrainian parliament removed the president from power, and elections were held to determine who would replace the Russian sympathizer. Unfortunately, the Euromaidan Revolution, as it is called, appeared to be largely managed by the United States Department of State. Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, in a phone conversation explains to Jeffrey Piat, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, quote, "I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience," end quote. Unfortunately for Nuland, this phone call was leaked by Russian authorities. Klitsch, Vitaly Klitschko, and Yats, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, were two of the three main opposition leaders to the Yankovych government. Although, quote, Klitschko has been the top dog, end quote, Yatsenyuk, weeks after the call, became prime minister, just as Nuland wished. Again, Nuland, in a speech delivered to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, reiterated the U.S. involvement in Ukrainian government. Quote, "We have invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine. That will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine," end quote. These grandiose goals of a prosperous and democratic Ukraine sound noble. However, the result of Victoria Nuland and the United States Department of State's assistance to Ukraine has resulted in the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky withholding elections, governing past his term's expiration, and the death of around 55,000 Ukrainian citizens. In response to this foreign regime change, pro-Russian separatists sparked conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. These separatist movements are most likely controlled by Moscow and undoubtedly receive funding from the Russian government. Violence culminated in the 2014-2015 Minsk agreements. The agreements called for a ceasefire and autonomy for the Donbas region while remaining part of Ukraine, yet violence remained as both parties felt their opposite was not following through with the stipulations. By 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky received a massive amount of the Ukrainian vote for running on a peace platform, yet refused to yield to Russia's demand for Donbass's full autonomy. It is important to keep in mind 38% of the population in Luhansk identifies as Russian, and 68% of the population uses Russian as their native language. 38.2% of the Donetsk region's population identifies as Russian, and 75% uses Russian as their native language. In 2021, the Ukrainian president, in a call with U.S. President Joe Biden, pushed Biden to provide Ukraine with a NATO membership action plan. Coinciding with Ukraine's desire to join NATO, Russia had amassed a substantial military force near the border of Ukraine. In hopes of one last effort in diplomacy, Putin demanded legal guarantees, primarily centering around security for the Russian state, as well as diplomatic resolutions when parties engage in disagreements. Mainstream media sources such as The Guardian have unfairly characterized the, quote, Treaty on Security Guarantees, end quote, as, quote, an attempt to formalize a new Russian sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, end quote. The treaty is incredibly short, and I urge every viewer to view it themselves so they can see the reasonable and diplomatic nature of the proposal. Unfortunately, after rejection from the West, Putin decided to launch a full-scale, brutal invasion of Ukraine. This has turned Ukraine, as Robert Kennedy Jr. puts it, quote, into an abattoir of death for the flower of the Ukrainian youth in order to advance a geopolitical ambition of certain people within the White House, end quote. To fully illustrate the reluctance of Western nations to facilitate peace, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson informed Zelensky that Western nations would not support the peace deal that had been proposed in Istanbul 2022. The peace deal offered security guarantees and a withdrawal of Russian troops for Ukraine in order for a pledge that Ukraine would remain neutral and refrain from hosting foreign military bases. The potential armistice apparently came too early for the prime minister, who stated, according to the Ukrainian news outlet Ukrainska Pravda, quote, "Even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements on guarantees with Putin, they are not," end quote. To fully dispense claims made by media like the New York Times that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked, one must be informed of the, quote, "Niet means niet," end quote, cable. U.S. Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, now director of the CIA, cabled a foreboding message to 2008 Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. The leaked cable informs the United States Department of State that the entire Russian political class would, quote, "view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat." NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains an emotional and neuralgic issue for Russia, end quote. Although aware of this Russian red line, the United States government continued to provoke Russia into militaristic response. Economist Jeffrey Sachs elucidates the complete lack of diplomacy between President Biden and President Putin, who, according to Sachs, have not spoken once since February 2022, the invasion by Russia. Quote, "It's just unbelievable to not even speak, to not try to understand each other's position, to not discuss, to not try to find a way out, when now the most accurate assessment is that there are at least 1 million Ukrainians dead or severely wounded. The United States has not even lifted a finger to try to talk to the other side," end quote. It remains unclear what the exact motivations are that caused the leaders of the United States foreign policy to implement these devastating political decisions. What remains clear is the use of the Ukrainian people and military by the United States to fight a proxy war against Russia. Former United States Representative Tulsi Gabbard asserts the U.S. is conducting this war, quote, "using the Ukrainian military and people as their chess pieces in this geopolitical chess game, the ultimate objective being regime change with Russia," end quote.